I would like Australian listeners to consider this a message from the future. If you do not deal with growing wealth inequality, you will see living standards and housing affordability to continue to collapse.
You say you've put your finger on the key economic problem facing Australia and indeed the world. What is that wider problem?
It's inequality of wealth. It's inequality of wealth. It is the aggressive accumulation of vast amounts of wealth by the very, very, very rich. I'm not even really talking the 1% here. We're talking the 0.1%, maybe even more. They are accumulating wealth at an unbelievably rapid pace, and it's squeezing everybody else out. It's pushing up the price of things like, most obviously housing, but not just housing. You know, you look at stock markets all over the world, you look at the gold price, you look at land prices. I think the best example of it is this, right? Let's take Rupert Murdoch, very famous, wealthy Australian. I checked his net wealth before I came in today. Apparently it's 25 billion, according to Google. If he makes just 4% a year on that, which is not a lot, this guy is going to be making every single year $1 billion passive income, right? $1 billion passive income, what is that a week? That's going to be $20 million a week, all right? This guy's making $3 million a day passive income. Imagine you had $3 million a day passive income, right? How much of it would you spend?
Probably a lot.
A lot of it? What, half? Do you reckon you could spend $1.5 million a day?
It's not really possible, is it?
Well, this is the thing. You'd spend 20 grand a day somehow. I probably couldn't spend 20 grand a day. That leaves you with almost the whole $1.5 million left to just buy assets. And if you allow the wealth of these very wealthy people to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow, they basically have no choice but to buy assets. And what you then see as your ordinary working class British or Australian is you see asset prices going up. And you see house prices going up. And you might think that's a good thing. And I think a lot of older British people and a lot of older Australians do think it's a good thing. But the problem is, once you've sold that house and you've used that money to have a fantastic retirement, what do your kids do? What do your kids do when the average Australian house in one of your big cities costs not $1 million, but $2 million? And they're forced to borrow $2 million just to buy a house. And they have to pay the interest on that $2 million. What is happening here is the unbelievably rapid growth in the wealth of the richest people in your country, in my country, in the world, is squeezing out ordinary working class British and Australian workers, and they can't afford homes. Then they need to take out massive mortgages. And if you're taking out a massive mortgage, what does that mean? It means you're paying more interest to these billionaires, which means that your wealth goes up even slower. Their wealth goes up even quicker. I realised this back in 2011 because I was sitting there, and I worked as a trader from 2008 to 2014. And what I saw was economists from wealthy backgrounds continually predicting recoveries that didn't happen. And why was that happening? Because ordinary people didn't have money to spend. And when you look into the situation of ordinary working class people, what I saw then and what you will see now is an older generation, ordinary middle class people who could afford homes, and a younger generation who could not afford homes. Who owns those homes now? And what you're seeing is this wealth growing and growing and growing and squeezing everybody else out. The middle class, the working class. I mean, here in this country, there's been an unbelievably precipitous collapse in government wealth. And what you're seeing now is the government in this country, one of the richest historic countries in the world, shutting down the welfare state, shutting down, you know, the hospitals, the police, the courts, the schools. Everything's being shut down because the government wealth is gone. And where is that wealth now? Where is that wealth now? That is the question. If you allow all over the wealth to be squeezed out of your middle class and to be monopolised by the wealthy, then you end up with these super unequal societies which have terrible living conditions for ordinary people. I think Australia is a really interesting example, right? Because you have a country here with a phenomenal amount of natural wealth. And you would think that a country, low population density, enormous natural wealth, should be able to provide really good living conditions for its workers. And Australia has done a good job of that for a long period of time, but they're losing it. They're losing it because that wealth is starting to concentrate. And once it concentrates, it no longer works for the benefit of ordinary people. And I think Australians should look at the story we learn from countries in Latin America, from countries in Africa, that are similar in the sense that they have an enormous amount of natural resources, but if it becomes monopolised by a tiny minority, they can use that to crush living standards for working people. And, you know, I'm talking to you from the UK now, where living standards are falling unbelievably quickly. And I would like Australian listeners to consider this a message from the future. If you do not deal with growing wealth inequality, you will see living standards and housing affordability to continue to collapse for your kids and your grandkids.
What I reckon people don't maybe understand is how billionaires are taking advantage of workers. How can you explain that to Australians? How can you explain how they're being exploited?
The first thing to understand is a little bit how much wealth there is. Especially in Australia, there's a phenomenal amount of wealth. I think for an ordinary person, most ordinary people are never able to own a significant amount of wealth beyond their home, because houses are so phenomenally expensive now. Most people spend their whole life, they're lucky if they ever pay off their mortgage. They might accumulate like a little bit of a pension fund. I encourage people here in London to walk down the high street or walk down central London and look at how much wealth is around them. I live near Canary Wharf, which is our big skyscraper district here in London. These massive skyscrapers, they're all owned. Go to the centre, right? The theatres, the restaurants, the bars, the clubs, all of these buildings, they're all owned. All of the farmland, it's all owned. What you have in Australia is this enormous amount of natural wealth, this phenomenal amount of natural wealth, which, nobody made that. These mining magnates, they didn't put that in the ground. God put that there for you guys, and you should be using it for the good of the Australian people. Look at what Norway's done. Norway's taken that wealth, made the sovereign wealth fund, and then once that wealth is owned by the government, then the government is collecting that passive income. And what that means is the government can then provide really good level of public services without having to tax working people that much. Norway is not the only country that's done that, right? You look at these countries in the Middle East, countries like Qatar, countries like the UAE that have managed to take their natural wealth, use it for the good of the people of that country.
Is that about taxation?
Well, it's not even about taxation, really. It's about who owns it. It's about who owns it. And, there are different ways you can do it, right? Like, if you are going to give your natural resources to private companies, you should make sure that you get a phenomenal good deal there, and you should be taking a big share of the profits. But I think another part of this, a big part of this, is the way we tax individuals. Listen, I've said it before, I come from a working class background. I come from a poor family. I made a few million quid, and I'm very proud of that, and I pay my taxes on it. And in this country, the top rate at the time was 50%. Plus other taxes, you're talking about paying 60%. So I worked hard, I made a few million quid, I paid 60% on that. At the same time, the Duke of Westminster, historic aristocracy in this country, inherits £10 billion, more than 3,000 times what I made, and pays nothing. If this is the tax system that you have, it is inevitable that over time, ordinary people will own less and less and less and less, and the billionaires will own more and more and more and more. And I think there's a phenomenal naivety here about the protection of middle class and working class and government wealth. Australia is a young country, right? You don't have the history that we have here in Europe of hundreds, thousands of years of ordinary people living in desperate poverty while a tiny elite live in extreme luxury, okay? If you do not take care of protecting your middle class wealth, you will lose it. And then you will look like Brazil, you will look like India, you will look like a country where a tiny elite lives an incredibly luxurious life and ordinary working class people struggle to pay the bills. And it's happening here in the UK.
Gary Stevenson, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks.